Currently, I'm sitting in the best Porsche 911 ever made. Yes, have you seen the latest, the brand new 911 Carrera, actually in 2026? I can't believe it, they've actually cranked up the prices. I was looking this morning on the site, the website, the Porsche website, and they went from 2025, if you look at the sticker price, was 120 grand, which is an extraordinarily high price by all accounts, to 2026, all of a sudden the prices jumped up to $129,000 or $130,000 plus. And it begs the question, how are they doing this? Is it because of trade, you know, the exchange? Is it because the dollar, the exchange rate? Is it has something to do with, you know, tariffs? Does it have something to do with some new technology in this new car? Is there something new and fresh that a lot of us just aren't really aware of? Well, it may be any one of those, but the bottom line is that the focus is the prices are going up at an alarming rate. Now, there was a time when, you know, when I started out, I would say 20, 30 years ago, when you look at a 911 and you say, look, as long as you had a good paying job, you could pretty much afford to buy a 911. It's something that you'd have to prioritize, but you could probably make it happen. But now what we're seeing is a lot of people are in debt up to their eyeballs and beyond. People are, you know, getting into way beyond. Did you hear the latest statistic? About 1 in 5, or about 20% of car loans now are over $1,000 a month. And that's on the US side of the border. When you're talking about Canada, you're probably at $1,500 to $1,800 a month, because realistically, that doesn't get you a lot of vehicle. So to buy a brand new 911, even a base Carrera, you're pretty much stuck paying $2,500, maybe $3,000 a month just to get into something lower trim level. Well, clearly affordability kind of went out the window many moons ago, and you know, that's what I love about getting into a car that you can actually afford, because repossessions are actually on the rise. I've been kind of reading that this morning as well. Repos are climbing. People are losing touch with the affordability. There's a crisis, and you know, on one hand, you say, well, people have money. People have money whenever you go to concerts, you go to restaurants, you go to those favorite outings. Maybe there's something new going on in your city. These places are packed. You know, you look at, what is it? You know, K-Days in Edmonton. You look at, you know, the Calgary Stampede, and a lot of cities basically have these big fairs, and these fairs are breaking records on attendance. People are spending money, and it's costing more to get in every single year. It's getting more expensive to go to these places, more expensive to eat out. It's getting more expensive to drive your fun new car, but yet we're seeing lots of new cars on the road. We're always seeing people driving and, you know, going to these big expensive restaurants, and a lot of these packed out facilities are clearly full of people that had money to get in there. But the question really becomes is, how much is too much, and how are people affording this? See, my take has always been buy within your means. My assumption that I've always taken is, you know, if I have to take a loan, it better be a really short loan. Ideally, the best way to go for me was cash. And right now, in the last number of years, I truly believe in paying cash as you go. If I can't afford a car cash, then I can't afford a car. And you know, you could kind of spin that any which way, but the way I see this is being able to get the bank to qualify you for an 84-month loan or 96-month loan at $1,500 a month, just because they for some reason deem that your salary and your income somehow makes that criteria, and they're willing to give you that loan, doesn't mean that you can truly afford it. And I really don't believe in overextending myself to the point where you can't afford it, you're underwater. Nobody wants to be car poor, nobody wants to be house poor. I mean, all that does is add stress, and you know, the last thing I wanted to have is stress in my life. Nobody needs extra stress. So I've always believed in getting into something that I can afford, and it may be the best thing since sliced bread, and it may not be, but it is going to be affordable, and that's the way I see it. And you know, there's always going to be that level where you can't afford it. It's just a little bit too much. But that's okay. I'm truly more of taking the assumption that, oh, we got some real noisemakers over here. Got some road work. But let's actually, you know what, how about this? Why don't we go for a ride in this car and we'll explain it, shall we? All right, let's talk about this, shall we? You know, there's a million places on the internet you find people and lots of influencers all over the net that are, you know, driving all these fun cars. They're always driving the latest, you know, Porsche or the latest Ferrari or the latest Lamborghini, and it begs the question, how? I mean, I don't know about you, but from my take is, I look at this and I think, and for years I've said to myself, how can they afford that? I mean, it's really not a jealousy thing, but I really think about this and the volume of people, and in some cases, I just wonder to myself, how can people afford to buy some of these cars? And then what's interesting is it all starts to make a little bit more sense. As you start to unravel what's going on in social media, you know, the ability to rent these cars is easy. A lot of big cities now you can rent these cars. The ability to take short-term high-interest loans or lease rates that are extraordinarily high but allows you in a short-term lease term. There's people that are able to make their dreams come true for a short period of time. You see, but the problem that with that all is, a lot of people end up buying these cars, and you'll notice a lot of these, you know, these influencers that you might see on the internet or you see around, a lot of them are doing it on the premise that they can't do it long term. It's not sustainable. And who cares what people can afford? Ultimately, it's their own money. But I'll tell you, and that's fine, because I love seeing content. I love seeing cool cars on the internet. But one thing I personally would struggle with the idea of having to dole out, you know, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 a month payments just to have a McLaren in my driveway for 6 months and eat crow and eating cat food just for the sake of trying to, you know, make ends meet, right? Just to try to make those payments for content. Now, it's content creation, so I get it. But there's that element of, how did they do it? And why would you subject yourself to that level of stress? Rather, I take a little simpler approach. I look at a 911 and, for example, $130,000, and nobody gets out the door with 130 grand. That car is going to be 145, 150 grand out the door. I mean, you got taxes, you got PPF, you got all these other things. So now that 130 is easily going to be a $150,000 car. You're going to want a few little extras on there, and it's just going to be extraordinarily expensive to own. Okay, so that's the thing, is I just don't, you know, I've never wanted to go down that path of becoming car poor. Rather, you know, I take these incremental steps, and I drive cars that maybe aren't necessarily today's news. See, to chase the clout, and if you really get down to it, the latest and the greatest supercars, hypercars, Porsches, the GT3 RS gets so much clout right now on the internet, as does the Aventador SVJ. There's certain cars that just seem to get the clout, they get all the attention, and they get, you know, when you see those on the internet, everybody recognizes those cars as being probably some of the most substantial cars. And for rightly so, they're great cars. But there's so many other cars that don't even get a sniff, and a lot of it's simply because they don't carry that brand, that name, that style. And in many cases, what you actually have is scenarios where the older cars are actually more interesting. You know, I use an example like an SVJ. Many would argue that the older Murcielagos and the Diablos come from an era where they're truly analog driving experiences. You know, they'll have gated shifters, they got the big doors in the V12, but they may be a little down on power, but they have all of the drama, the sensation, the recognized looks and designs, and they carry every bit as much clout, but maybe not in social media. But you know, you could likely get yourself still a decent Murcielago for probably even an early gated Mercy for, you know, a 2003, 2004 early gated car for about half the price of an SVJ. And yet you could use the argument it's got twice the personality. I've driven Murcielagos, and I think they're probably some of the coolest supercars you can get your hands on today. Now, they're not coming cheap either, but the point I'm trying to make is sometimes you don't have to spend the top beans. Sometimes driving what's deemed as yesterday's news is, in some cases, almost the better way to go. I mean, even think of Ferrari. Here, how about this one for a second? You know, you get all the clout, the A12 super fast and the SF90s and the Stradale this and the Spiders that. But wait a minute. You think of some of the older cars. Think of it, one of the best, slightly underrated cars you can buy today is the 430 6-speed gated car. That's right, that was the last car that you could get which naturally aspirated V8 in the Ferrari world that also gave you the gated shifter. Because after that, they came out with the 458 Italia that went strictly dual clutch. You couldn't get a manual anymore. Also, the 360s weren't bad either. You could still get those in a gated car. Now, those were a little bit more maintenance intensive, had a little less power. They weren't quite the same flash. But, you know, the 430 and even the 360s, and really, if you want to get down to it, any gated Ferrari, even preceding those, are arguably even more entertaining. You get the smell of that Gucci aroma, you know, the smell of an old Ferrari with that leather interior, and, you know, the knobs and the buttons aren't aligned and things aren't sitting right in there, and maybe they don't function right. You might have the odd electrical gremlin, and it's that personality that these old supercars have. They have this personality, the smell, the imperfection, the quality maybe isn't there. You know, the parts and pieces may be hard to come by and source, but there's sort of an exclusive feel to driving an old exotic car that you just can't get in some of the new cars. You know, I'll tell you, let me just kind of put this on the table for a second. You know, prior to me buying the 296, and I did really want to treat myself. The idea was try something the latest and greatest, put something on the table that is, you know, McLaren P1 fast, Ferrari LaFerrari fast, 918 Spider fast, but without spending the $4 million. I wanted, what's the latest, and that was the greatest. And Ferrari came out with the 296, and I want to experiment with that. That said, I was looking at some of the old dogs. I was too, before I bought the 296, I was looking at some of the old dogs, the Murcielagos, the gated Ferraris, the, you know, even an Aventador, but early models. I was looking at things that were a bit more analog and a little bit more, you know, hands-on, a little bit more old school, not necessarily from the DIY perspective, somewhat from the affordability perspective, of course, because as you get in some of the older cars, you can get all of the same excitement and entertainment, at least that's usable on the street, but you can do so for fractions of the money from some of these cars. I mean, as soon as you sign over and you make that payment on that brand new Ferrari or brand new Lambo, and, you know, or Vuelto now, you know, in Canadian dollars is probably close to, you know, $700,000-800,000 Canadian. That's a lot of money. $1 million to tie up in a car. I can't fathom that. And the real question is not about whether you can afford that. The real question is, are you going to get the value and the excitement from that car that you can't find in something, say, like a gated Mercy, or, you know, like an early Aventador, or, you know, like, you know, I could throw names and numbers around all day long, but the point is not about, you know, whether you should or shouldn't buy any of these cars. I mean, they're all kind of pointless in a lot of ways, but the point is, sometimes buying that older car just kind of makes sense. When you think about the money people are spending just to get clout, the way the money, the leases, the loans, the financing, what people are doing to put themselves in that level of stress is absolutely astronomical. And, you know, I've said this, you call me the poor guy, and some people kind of laugh, you bought a Ferrari, this and that and the other, but it is true. It's true in the sense that I do believe if you can't afford to write a check or pay cash for that car, you probably can't afford it, really. And especially even more so if it's a toy. It's one thing if it's a business and you're buying, say, big commercial truck and it's doing a bunch of hauling and there's a bunch of cash flow and flow through charges related to that vehicle. Now, that's a business asset making you money. It's different if you're making payments on something like that. But if you're making payments on a $600,000 supercar that sits in your garage for 348 days of the year, then you've got to ask yourself, is that the best way to spend money, especially when you would start incurring bank rates, and you know the banks start charging you, you know, 4, 5, 6, 8%, 10%. You know, you start thinking about the cost to actually borrow. Then you incorporate depreciation on the new vehicles, because every new vehicle goes down. We're seeing what's going on in the, you know, the new hybrid territory, especially with Ferraris, you know, the SF90s, the 296, the Revuelto, the McLaren Arturo. Any of these hybrid supercars are all depreciating at an alarming rate. Now you add depreciation, couple that with your interest charges on the loan or lease rates. Wow, that's a recipe for some serious money lost. So then it begs the question, you know, instead of buying that new 911, which will depreciate, although 911s tend to be some of the best cars for not depreciating and certainly for holding their value, you know, I'm going to just put this out there and say, you know what, maybe there's a better choice than a brand new 911 at 130 grand, and you know, 5 years later that car's worth 100 grand. Now we know certain models will go up in value. The GT series of cars do well, even some of the turbos do well, but a lot of those don't do well until, you know, they're kind of that 15 years, 10 to 15 years later, when they've bottomed out and they start to creep back up as the desirability of that car seems to finally hit the general market. But for the first 5 to 10 years, most 911s, aside from maybe a GT3 RS, seems to be dropping in value. And so the question is there a better place to spend your money? And I think there could be. And again, it's ultimately boils down to, can you afford it? I mean, the best Porsche in my world, according to my perspective, is a Porsche that you can actually afford. You see? So if you want to break this down and say, like, what is the best 911 that money can buy? Well, let's take a look. I'll show you, shall we? And here we have, and I've showed you this car before, but it's the 996. For me, this was the only car at the time, we've had this now for a little bit, at the time is the car that we could afford. We had money tied up elsewhere in real estate and some investment, and there was other places we had our money tied up at the time, but we wanted to get into kind of something more analog. And now this is not a Murcielago. This is an old 996 911. Let's put that on the table. It's not the same thing in most cases. In some cases, you could use the argument that this might be even better. I can drive this car to Vancouver and not worry about it making it. And so there are attributes to these cars that just make sense. But at the time, I didn't want to spend a ton of money because a 996 is not, in the Porsche world, as good as a 997. Everybody in the Porsche world is going to say a 997 is a better car because it gives you the older headlights, kind of the more conventional rounder headlights. It has a little bit more flair to it. It has a nicer, some would argue, a slightly different interior. I wouldn't even say nicer, but certainly a different interior. And you know, the later cars have the glass window on the back convertibles. The 997s have some revisions to things like the IMS, the intermediate shaft bearing, and some small improvements, although they basically, the early generation of the 997s also carry the M96 engine, which some people say is the worst engine ever, but it's funny how it's often referenced as the worst engine when talking about it being in an early Boxster or an early 911 996. But in reality, that engine's carried through for a few years, and in some better variants of the 911, you can find a very similar drivetrain. So the ultimate question is, what is the best 911? Well, I was driving in the best 911 for me. At the time, I would have rather have spent something like $30,000 on a car like this than spend $130,000 on a new 911. A new 911's way better in every single way, almost, except that it's very digital now. They have digital dashboards, very electronic. They're way faster, but a lot more electronic. And pretty much, have you ever even tried to change a spark plug in a turbo car, a modern day turbo car, or a late model 911? Very difficult procedure. So to get into a 911 that you can afford is ultimately the best 911. And that goes for any car. I mean, just buy what you can truly afford. And I think going into hawk, going into debt over your toy isn't necessarily the best. We see it all over the internet, but it's becoming generalized. It's becoming popular conversation, and it's becoming something that's loosely thrown around about all these expensive cars. And really, if you really break it down, just watch how long some of these cars stay in the possession of some of these content creators, because I think that's the most telling. When you see somebody and they've got the car and they've had it for 7 or 8 years, there's a pretty good chance they've bought it, they've owned it, it's paid off, and they own that, they can afford it. But when you see somebody get in a car, they flip it, they buy another one. This happens seems like every 2 months they're in a new car, and then they're flipping it another 3 months. And this goes round and round. That's not really owning a car. And I come from the old school, and a lot of you guys, I know, are coming from the same place, where you believe true ownership comes in ownership. And I know we can't take it with us when we go, but there's an element of, you know what, I'm going to drive this home, I'm going to polish it up, this is my car. There's a sense of pride we all take, whether it's an old 911, whether it's a hot rod, whether it's a 1988 Fox body Mustang, whether it's your ZL1 Camaro, whether it's whatever it is. If it's your pride and joy, own it, wear it, love it, and use it. We're car enthusiasts, and that's what I'm talking about, is having the enthusiasm and the love for cars, but doing it in a way that makes it affordable, doing it in a way that you can afford, not in a way that the expectations are set by social media or your friends or trying to play with the Joneses. Rather, do what you can afford. I'm going to show up to a party with this car, and there's people that are probably going to say, oh yeah, oh that's an old one. Yeah, what is that, an 01? It is. But there will always be that. But that's okay. I know I don't have car payments. I know I can enjoy it. I can get in, go for a rip. I can fix a lot of these problems with these things. And at the end of the day, I love this car. It's a lot of fun. Drop the top, get in, go for a rip. If it sits on the street, I'm not getting paranoid about it. I can drive it to the mall and not get totally over paranoid about it. And well, yes, I went crazy on my other car. The point is, that was sort of a one-off experience. And I don't know. We'll see with that one for sure. I love the 296. It's absolutely spectacular. But let me be totally clear. Just because you drive an old Miata, an old 911, an old MR2, an old Mustang, I don't care. Remember, some of those older cars have more personality. They have the flair, they have the fun, they have the raw factor. I had a chance recently to drive another one of those supercharged MR2s. Remember, like back in 1989? Wow, was that ever a fun little car. Zippy, punchy, the driving position was right on point. That's one of the best cars again, just like the old Miatas. Some of the best cars and some of the best driving fun comes in older cars now. And it's not about the clout. Drive what you can afford. Who gives a crap about what other people think? Because I've never cared what other people think. If I did, I'd be doing the same as everybody else, but I don't. I'm driving something like this. Okay, it's not the latest. I'm good with that. I'm having fun with it, and it's paid off. So I'm just saying the best 911 is one that not necessarily costs $130,000 plus PPF taxes and fees. No, it's one that you can just actually afford, get into, enjoy it, and drive the wheels off of it. Anyway, be sure to hit that subscribe button. I hope you enjoyed the conversation today, everybody. And we're off to the races. Let's go for a ride.